In a small Midwest county auction field, a widowed music teacher was about to make a purchase that would put her life in mortal danger. What started as a routine property auction took a shocking turn when she came face to face with buried secrets worth fortunes. Margaret Kane wasn't your typical grieving widow. For 2 years, she had spent her life quietly teaching piano lessons and surviving on meager savings, known for her stubborn independence and deep love of forgotten music. When she encountered the crumbling amphitheater ruins, dismissed by everyone as worthless rubble, she had no idea she was walking into a web of corruption spanning generations. Margaret's 90-cent bid that would lead to the discovery of a criminal empire's most dangerous evidence. What began as an impulsive purchase of abandoned stones would become a battle against powerful families who had built fortunes on exploitation and murder. The entire county would never be the same after one determined woman refused to let truth stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip over the dusty crowd gathered in Miller's Field that September morning. I clutched my worn leather purse, feeling the $3 silver and handful of coins that represented nearly everything I had left after paying rent. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and the laughter of men who came to these county auctions for entertainment rather than necessity. "Next item," the auctioneer bellowed, consulting his weathered ledger. "Lot 47, the old amphitheater ruins on Blackstone Ridge. Half buried, mostly rubble. Starting bid is $2. A murmur of amusement rippled through the crowd. Someone behind me chuckled. "Who'd want that pile of stones?" I knew the place he meant. The crumbling structure had haunted the ridge above. Town for as long as anyone could remember, its broken arches poking through wild grass like the ribs of some ancient beast. Children dared each other to venture near it at twilight, spinning ghost stories about echoes that answered back in foreign tongues. $2, the auctioneer called again, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. "Anyone, it's got architectural significance, I'm told." The men around me shuffled their feet and studied their boots. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, whispered to her companion about what a waste of good farming land it was. Mayor Carlisle shook his head with the authority of someone who'd long ago given up on progress, reaching their small corner of the Midwest. My hand moved to my purse before my mind had fully decided. The motion was instinctive, driven by something I couldn't name. Perhaps it was the memory of my late husband James reading to me about ancient theaters where voices could carry to the very gods. Perhaps it was simply that I recognized abandonment when I saw it, and my heart had always been drawn to forgotten things. $1, I called out, my voice barely audible above the wind. Every head turned toward me. The auctioneer squinted, as if trying to determine whether I was serious. The crowd's amusement shifted to something between pity and bewilderment. "Did Margaret Kane just bid on those ruins?" someone whispered, not bothering to lower their voice. $1, the auctioneer repeated, pointing his gavel in my direction. "Do I hear 150? Silence stretched across the field like morning fog. A crow cawed from somewhere overhead, the sound harsh and mocking. Going once, going twice. 90 cents, I interrupted, my voice stronger now. "That's what I can afford." The crowd erupted in laughter. Ben Morrison, who owned the largest farm in 3 counties, slapped his knee, haggling down from her own bid. "Margaret, you're either the smartest woman here or the most foolish." The auctioneer looked genuinely perplexed. He'd probably never had someone bid lower than their opening offer, but something in my expression must have convinced him I was serious, because he nodded slowly. 90 cents it is, then. Any other takers?" He waited exactly 3 seconds. "Sold to Mrs. Kane for 90 cents. The laughter followed me as I made my way to the payment table, my cheeks burning but my spine straight. I counted out the coins carefully, 8 dimes and 2 nickels, placing them in the clerk's palm with the dignity of someone purchasing a mansion rather than a pile of ancient stones. "You'll want this, I suppose," the clerk said, handing me a deed so faded the ink had turned brown, "though I can't imagine what you plan to do with it." I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. Neither can I just yet. The crowd had already moved on to more sensible lots, farm equipment, livestock, a perfectly good barn that would fetch real money. But I remained where I was, staring across the fields toward Blackstone Ridge, where my amphitheater waited. My amphitheater. The phrase felt strange and wonderful on my tongue. As the afternoon wore on and the auction continued around me, I found myself planning. I had no money for proper excavation, no knowledge of archaeology or architecture. What I had was time, endless stretches of it, since the school board had decided they could no longer afford a music teacher, and a stubbornness that had seen me through 2 years of widowhood without asking for charity. When the auction finally ended and the crowd dispersed, I walked alone up the winding path to Blackstone Ridge. The amphitheater sat in a natural depression, its remaining walls rising no more than 4 feet above the encroaching earth. Weeds grew thick between the stone seats, and ivy had claimed the stage area entirely. But as I stood there in the dying light, I could almost see it as it once had been. The curved rows of seating, the perfect acoustics that would have carried a whisper from the stage to the highest seats. Someone had built this place with love, and care had dreamed of voices and music filling the space. I walked down the crumbling steps toward the stage, my footsteps echoing strangely in the growing dusk. At the bottom, I turned to face the empty seats and cleared my throat. "Hello?" I called softly, feeling foolish, but compelled to try. The word came back to me, changed somehow, richer and fuller than it should have been from such a modest space. I tried again, louder this time. "Hello!" The echo that returned seemed to carry harmonies I hadn't sung, voices I'd never heard. For just a moment, I could have sworn I heard an orchestra tuning in the distance, the soft murmur of an audience settling into their seats. Then the moment passed, leaving only the wind through the weeds and the first stars appearing overhead. But something had awakened in me during those few seconds, something that had been sleeping since James died. Purpose, perhaps, or simply the recognition that some things were worth preserving, even if, especially if, no one else could see their value. I pulled the deed from my pocket and read it again by moonlight. Margaret Kane, owner of one ruined amphitheater, purchased for 90 cents at public auction. It was the best investment I'd ever made. 3 days later, I returned to the amphitheater with borrowed tools and a determination that surprised even me. Mrs. Henderson had shaken her head when I'd asked to borrow her late husband's shovel and pickaxe, but she'd handed them over with the resigned air of someone watching a friend make a beautiful mistake. "Just promise me you won't hurt yourself out there, Margaret," she'd said, wrapping a jar of lemonade in yesterday's newspaper. "And take this. Lord knows you'll work up a thirst moving all that stone." The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and my breath misted as I climbed the familiar path to Blackstone Ridge. In daylight, the amphitheater looked even more forlorn than it had during my moonlit visit. 40 years of neglect had reduced what must once have been a marvel to little more than suggestion and shadow. But suggestions could be followed, and shadows often revealed more than full sunlight. I started with the stage area, carefully pulling away ivy and clearing debris from what appeared to be a raised platform. Beneath the tangle of roots and fallen leaves, I found smooth stone, not the rough field stone common to our area, but something finer, with a subtle pattern worked into its surface. By midday, they'd uncovered nearly 20 square feet of intricate mosaic work. Tiny tiles in blues and golds formed swirling patterns that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. At the center, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated dirt, I could make out the figure of a woman with arms raised toward the sky. A performer, perhaps, or a goddess of music. I sat back on my heels, wiping sweat from my forehead despite the cool air. The physical work felt good after months of sitting idle, but it was more than that. Each stone I uncovered felt like a word in a conversation I was only beginning to understand. "You were magnificent once, weren't you?" I murmured to the half-buried seats. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A sigh, perhaps, or the ghost of applause carried on the wind. I held my breath, straining to listen, but heard only the rustle of leaves and the distant lowing of cattle. I returned to my work, but the sensation of being watched remained, not malevolently, more like the feeling of performing for an audience holding its breath in anticipation. When I hummed while I worked, the melody seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, as if the space itself was reluctant to let the music go. By afternoon, I'd made remarkable progress. The stage was nearly clear, revealing not just the mosaic, but also what appeared to be a sophisticated drainage system carved into the stone. Whoever had built this place had understood both engineering and acoustics in ways that put our modern buildings to shame. It was while clearing debris from the orchestra pit that I made my first real discovery. Hidden beneath a fallen section of the back wall was an opening, not a natural cave, but a carefully constructed passage leading down into darkness. The entrance had been sealed with stones, but decades of settling earth had shifted them enough to create a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I knelt beside the opening, peering into the blackness below. Cool air drifted up from the depths, carrying scents of old stone and something else, something that might have been incense, though I couldn't be sure. The passage walls were smooth, clearly man-made, and older than anything I'd seen in our county. "What secrets are you hiding?" I whispered. To my amazement, I heard my words echo back from the depths, but changed somehow. Where I had whispered, the echo sang, a hauntingly beautiful melody that raised goosebumps along my arms. I tried it again, speaking a simple hello into the darkness. The response was unmistakably musical, as if the underground space was somehow transforming speech into song. My heart raced with the implications. This wasn't just an amphitheater. It was something far more sophisticated, designed by someone who understood acoustics in ways that bordered on magical. I wanted desperately to explore the passage. But darkness was falling and I had no lantern. More importantly, some instinct warned me that this discovery was significant enough to be dangerous. If there truly were secrets buried beneath the amphitheater, they were secrets someone had gone to great lengths to hide. As I gathered my tools in the fading light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the soft earth near the entrance. Boots larger than mine, and recent enough that the morning dew hadn't settled in them. Someone else had been here. Someone who had watched me work, perhaps for hours, without making their presence known. I hurried up the path toward town, glancing back over my shoulder more than once. The amphitheater sat silent in the growing dusk, but I could swear I saw a flicker of movement near the sealed passage. A trick of shadow, most likely, but it left me with the unsettling feeling that my innocent excavation had attracted attention I neither wanted nor understood. That night, I lay awake in my small cottage, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and settling sound. The deed to the amphitheater sat on my nightstand, and I found myself wondering what exactly I had purchased for 90 cents. Property, certainly, but possibly something much more valuable and dangerous than I'd bargained for. The echo of that underground melody haunted my dreams, beautiful and mysterious and somehow urgent, as if voices from the past were trying to tell me something I desperately needed to know. Professor Lucian Hale was exactly what I'd expected from his reputation. Wild hair that defied any attempt at grooming, ink stains on his cuffs, and the slightly bewildered expression of a man who lived more comfortably in the past than the present. His office at the State College was a chaos of books, maps, and artifacts that seemed to breed in the corners when no one was looking. "Mrs. Kane?" He looked up from a dusty tome as I knocked on his open door. I received your letter about some sort of archaeological discovery. Though I must warn you, my colleagues consider me something of a laughingstock these days. That's precisely why I've come to you, I said, settling into the chair across from his cluttered desk. I need someone who won't dismiss what I've found simply because it doesn't fit conventional wisdom. His eyebrows rose with the first genuine interest I'd seen since entering the building. How intriguing. And what exactly have you found? I told him everything. The auction, the mosaic, the underground passage with its impossible acoustics. As I spoke, his expression shifted from polite skepticism to rapt attention. By the time I described the musical echoes from the depths, he was leaning forward in his chair like a hound catching a scent. Roman-inspired architecture in the American Midwest, he murmured, more to himself than to me. I've theorized for years that such structures existed, but the academic establishment, he trailed off, shaking his head. They laughed me out of the last 3 conferences. Then this could vindicate your theories? Professor Hale stood abruptly, knocking over a stack of papers in his enthusiasm. Mrs. Kane, if what you've described is genuine, and I have every reason to believe it is, then we're looking at evidence of sophisticated cultural exchange decades, perhaps centuries, before anyone thought possible. The acoustic properties alone would represent engineering knowledge that supposedly didn't exist in this region. His excitement was infectious, but I sensed something else beneath it, a desperate hunger for redemption that made me slightly wary. Still, I needed his expertise, and he needed my discovery. It seemed a fair exchange. Would you be willing to come to the site? I asked. I have no formal training in archaeology, and I'm concerned about damaging something important. Willing? He laughed, the sound slightly manic. Mrs. Kane, I would crawl across broken glass for the chance to examine such a find. When can we begin? We arranged to meet the following morning at the amphitheater. Professor Hale would bring proper excavation tools and his considerable knowledge of ancient construction techniques. I would provide access and, more importantly, local knowledge that might help us avoid unwanted attention. As I prepared to leave, he called after me. Mrs. Kane, you mentioned footprints, evidence that someone else has been observing your work. Have you considered that this discovery might be, shall we say, politically sensitive? What do you mean? He gestured to a map on his wall, marked with red pins in seemingly random locations. I've spent 15 years documenting rumors of unusual architecture in this region. Structures that appear in historical records, but vanish from official documentation. Always in areas that later became profitable for certain well-connected families. A chill ran down my spine. Are you suggesting someone deliberately buried these sites? I'm suggesting that some secrets are kept secret for very good reasons, and those reasons often have more to do with money and power than historical preservation. His expression grew serious. If your amphitheater connects to the broader pattern I've been tracking, then we need to be very careful about who we trust with our discoveries. I thought of Evangeline Price, whose family had owned most of the land around Blackstone Ridge for generations. I thought of the sealed passage and the fresh footprints, of the way the town had dismissed the amphitheater as worthless rubble. Professor Hale, I said slowly, what if the reason everyone knew to avoid that property wasn't because it was worthless, but because it was too valuable to risk exposing? His grin was sharp as a blade. Then, my dear Mrs. Kane, we're about to make some very powerful people extremely unhappy. The next morning dawned grey and misty, perfect weather for clandestine archaeology. Professor Hale arrived at the amphitheater, loaded down with equipment that looked more suited to a mining operation than academic research. Shovels, brushes, measuring tools, and what appeared to be some sort of primitive camera filled 2 canvas bags that he'd somehow managed to carry up the ridge path without collapsing. Impressive, he said, surveying my week's work on the stage area. You've uncovered more intact mosaic than I've seen in most professional digs. And the pattern, he knelt to examine the tiles more closely. This isn't local work. The style is definitely Mediterranean-influenced, but with modifications I've never seen before. Together, we began the delicate work of fully exposing the underground entrance. Professor Hale's trained eye immediately spotted details I'd missed. Tool marks on the stone that indicated the passage was hand-carved, mortar techniques that hadn't been used in America until decades after the amphitheater was supposedly built. And most intriguingly, symbols carved above the entrance that he identified as a mixture of Latin and something much older. "This is unprecedented," he muttered, carefully sketching the symbols in his notebook. "It's as if multiple cultural traditions converged here, created something entirely new. But why? And more importantly, why go to such lengths to hide it?" Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We spent the morning carefully removing stones from the passage entrance, working with the reverence of archaeologists and the nervous energy of grave robbers. Each stone revealed more of the elaborate construction beneath, smooth walls that curved into darkness, elaborate drainage systems, and acoustic features that made every whisper resonate like music. By noon, we had cleared an opening large enough for a person to enter safely. Professor Hale produced an oil lamp from his seemingly bottomless collection of equipment and held it at the entrance. "The passage extends farther than the light reaches," he reported. "The walls are decorated, carvings, possibly murals, and there's definitely a larger chamber ahead. The acoustics suggest significant space." I felt the familiar tingle of anticipation mixed with apprehension. "Should we go down?" He looked at me with the expression of a man who'd spent years dreaming of exactly this moment. "Mrs. Kane, we've come too far to turn back now. But I should warn you, once we step into that passage, we can't unknow what we find. If there are truly secrets buried down there, they may be secrets some people killed to keep." I thought of my quiet life, my small cottage, my routine of piano lessons and evening solitude. Then I thought of the music that had echoed from the depths, calling to something in my soul that had been silent too long. "Professor," I said, taking the lamp from his hands, "some secrets are worth the risk." Together, we descended into the darkness, leaving the familiar world above for whatever mysteries waited in the depths of the amphitheater. Behind us, unnoticed in the afternoon shadows, a figure watched from the tree line, noting our progress with the patient attention of someone for whom our discovery represented opportunity or threat. The lamp's flickering light revealed wonders that made my breath catch in my throat. We stood in a corridor carved from living rock, its walls adorned with murals that seemed to dance in the shifting shadows. Figures in elaborate costumes performed eternal scenes, masked dancers, musicians with instruments I'd never seen, audiences raised in rapture or bowed in reverence. "Extraordinary," Professor Hale whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Look at the technique, the preservation. These paintings could be centuries old, yet they're as vivid as if they were completed yesterday." We moved deeper into the passage, our footsteps muffled by what appeared to be fitted stone flooring. Side chambers branched off the main corridor, each one revealing new mysteries. In one, I found racks of costumes, silks and velvets in jewel tones, some still bearing the faint scent of stage powder and perfume. Another contained musical instruments in cases of polished wood, violins with inlaid mother-of-pearl, a harp strung with silver wire, brass horns that gleamed like captured sunlight. "These aren't relics," I said, running my fingers along the smooth neck of a violin. "They're perfectly preserved, as if someone planned to return for them." Professor Hale was examining a collection of rolled papers in waterproof containers. "Sheet music," he confirmed, unrolling one carefully. "And not just any compositions. Look at this signature. Mendelssohn, 1847. If this is authentic, it predates the composer's known American works by decades." The corridor ended in a circular chamber beneath what I realized must be the amphitheater's stage. Here, the acoustics we'd noticed above reached their full potential. Every whisper carried with crystal clarity, every footstep echoed with musical precision. The chamber was clearly designed as a preparation area for performances, with mirrors set into alcoves and benches where performers could wait for their cues. But it was what dominated the center of the chamber that made my heart race with both excitement and apprehension. An iron vault, easily 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, sat embedded in the floor like a metallic monument. Its surface was covered with the same symbols we'd found above the entrance, and, despite decades underground, it showed no signs of rust or decay. Most unsettling of all, the dust around its base was disturbed recently. "Someone's been here," I said, kneeling to examine the scuff marks in the ancient grime. "These footprints are fresh, Professor." Within the last few days, he joined me on the floor, his expression growing troubled. "The same size as those you found above ground. Someone has been watching your excavation very carefully indeed." I stood and approached the vault, running my hands along its surface. The metal was warm to the touch, despite the underground chill, and I could swear I felt a subtle vibration, as if something alive waited within. "There's no visible lock," Professor Hale observed, circling the vault with his lamp held high. "But there must be some mechanism. These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're instructions." We spent the better part of an hour examining the vault from every angle, tracing patterns and trying to decipher the ancient markings. It was during this investigation that I became acutely aware we were not alone. The feeling started as a prickling at the back of my neck, the sensation of being observed. Then came the sounds, subtle at first but growing more distinct. Footsteps above us, moving with the deliberate pace of someone trying not to be heard. The soft scrape of boots on stone, the whisper of fabric against wall. I touched Professor Hale's arm and pointed upward. His eyes widened as he caught the sounds I'd been hearing. Someone was in the amphitheater above us, and judging by their cautious movements, they knew exactly where we were. "We need to leave," I whispered, barely breathing the words. He nodded. But as we gathered our equipment, the footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something that chilled me to the bone, the sound of stones being moved. Heavy stones. Someone was sealing the entrance we'd worked so hard to clear. "Quickly!" Professor Hale hissed, extinguishing the lamp. We felt our way through the darkness toward the passage, guided by memory and the faint trace of fresher air from above. But when we reached the entrance, my worst fears were confirmed. The opening we'd carefully excavated was blocked again, sealed from the outside with stones that would take hours to move, even if we'd had proper tools. We were trapped. In the absolute darkness of the underground chamber, every sound seemed magnified. Our breathing, the rapid beating of my heart, the distant echo of movement above ground, all of it combined into a symphony of fear that made rational thought nearly impossible. "There has to be another way out," Professor Hale said, his voice steady despite our circumstances. "Spaces like this were always built with multiple exits. We just need to find them." But I was beginning to understand that our entrapment might not be random. Someone had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. They wanted us underground, away from witnesses, trapped with whatever secrets the vault contained. The question was, did they plan to keep us here permanently, or did they simply need time to prepare for whatever came next? As if in answer to my unspoken fears, I heard the sound of more voices above, multiple people this time, speaking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakably conspiratorial. "Professor," I whispered, "I think we've stumbled into something much more dangerous than historical preservation." In the darkness, I heard him fumble for matches to relight the lamp. When the flame caught, throwing dancing shadows on the carved walls around us, his expression was grim but determined. "Then we'd better find out what's in that vault before our watchers decide we've seen too much." 3 days later, after Professor Hale had devised an ingenious pulley system to move the stones blocking our exit, I was working in my garden when the most elegant woman I'd ever seen came walking up my front path. She moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched and admired, her burgundy dress impeccably tailored, and her silver hair arranged in a style that spoke of professional attention. Mrs. Kane, her voice carried the cultured tones of someone who'd received the finest education money could buy. "I'm Evangeline Price. I believe we have much to discuss." I straightened from my tomato plants, acutely aware of the dirt under my fingernails and the simple work dress I wore. Evangeline Price was a name everyone in our county knew. Old money, vast holdings, and influence that reached into every corner of local politics and society. "Mrs. Price," I managed, wiping my hands on my apron. "What brings you to my humble home?" Her smile was perfectly calculated to put me at ease, while simultaneously reminding me of the gulf between our social positions. "Your recent archaeological endeavors, my dear. Word travels quickly in small communities, and I must say your discovery has captured my imagination entirely." She gestured toward the amphitheater ridge, visible from my garden. "I've long believed that our region's history is far richer than most people realize. The Price family has owned land adjacent to your amphitheater for generations, and I've always felt there was something special about that particular site." I invited her inside for tea, my mind racing with questions and suspicions. How much did she know about what Professor Hale and I had found? And why was someone of her stature suddenly interested in my 90-cent purchase? "I'll be direct, Mrs. Kane," she said, as we settled in my modest parlor. "I represent a consortium of local historians and cultural preservationists. We're prepared to offer substantial funding for the proper restoration of your amphitheater, professional archaeologists, modern equipment, everything needed to uncover its secrets safely." The offer was tempting, almost impossibly so. I thought of the vault we'd been unable to open, the mysterious chamber that clearly held more secrets than Professor Hale and I could uncover alone. "That's very generous," I said carefully. "But I have to ask, what's your interest in this project? Surely there are more prominent archaeological sites that would benefit from such patronage." Evangeline's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and somehow artificial. "My interest is purely cultural, I assure you. The Price family has always been committed to preserving our region's heritage. And between you and me, I suspect your amphitheater may be connected to some rather fascinating local legends." She leaned forward conspirationally. "Have you heard the stories about secret societies that once operated in these parts? Underground networks of artists and intellectuals who gathered in hidden places to share ideas and performances that were, shall we say, ahead of their time." My pulse quickened. The chamber beneath the amphitheater, with its preserved costumes and instruments, suddenly took on new significance. "You think my amphitheater was connected to such activities?" "I think your amphitheater may have been the heart of them," she said, her eyes glittering with something that might have been excitement or greed. "Which is why it's so important that any excavation be handled with the utmost discretion. Some secrets once revealed carelessly can be problematic for the families whose ancestors were involved." The implicit threat in her words was subtle but unmistakable. I thought of the fresh footprints Professor Hale and I had found, the deliberate sealing of our entrance, the watchers we'd sensed above ground. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Evangeline reached into her elegant handbag and withdrew a folder of papers. "Full funding for restoration, professional supervision, and a generous monthly stipend for you as the site's caretaker. In exchange, I would serve as the project's coordinator, ensuring that any discoveries are properly documented and appropriately shared with the academic community." I scanned the documents, noting the impressive sums involved and the carefully worded clauses that would essentially place control of the project in Evangeline's hands. It was a beautiful trap, wrapped in silk and tied with golden ribbon. "I'll need time to consider this," I said, returning the papers to her. "Of course." She stood with fluid grace, smoothing her skirts. "But I should mention that my offer comes with certain protections. You've been working alone at a remote site, Mrs. Kane. That can be dangerous for a woman of your situation." I've taken the liberty of arranging for the Ashwood brothers to provide security for the amphitheater site. My blood turned cold. The Ashwood brothers were known throughout the county as enforcers for hire, men who solved problems that couldn't be addressed through legal channels. Their reputation for violence was matched only by their reputation for loyalty to whoever paid their considerable fees. "I appreciate your concern," I said, fighting to keep my voice level, but I've managed quite well on my own, have you? Her smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Because I've heard rumors of trespassers at your site. Fresh footprints where none should be. Someone has been watching your work, Mrs. Kane, and I doubt their intentions are as benevolent as mine." She moved toward the door with the confidence of someone accustomed to having the final word. "The Ashwood brothers will begin their patrols tonight. Consider it a gesture of good faith while you deliberate my proposal." After she left, I sat in my parlor staring at the contract she'd left behind. Everything about Evangeline Price screamed wealth, culture, and respectability. But beneath her polished exterior, I'd sensed something harder and more calculating than diamond. She knew more about the amphitheater than she was revealing. Her offer of protection felt more like a threat of surveillance, and her mention of secrets that could be problematic for certain families suggested that whatever was in that vault wasn't just historically significant, it was personally damaging to people with the power to make problems disappear. That evening, as twilight settled over Blackstone Ridge, I saw them. Two figures on horseback, silhouetted against the dying light, positioned where they could observe both the amphitheater and my cottage. The Ashwood brothers had arrived, and I was no longer working alone on my archaeological project. I was working under guard. Professor Hale arrived at dawn the next morning, his usual disheveled appearance heightened by obvious distress. He'd spent the night researching Evangeline Price's family history, and what he'd discovered had shaken him badly. "The Price family fortune has remarkably murky origins," he said, as we walked toward the amphitheater, under the watchful eyes of our mounted guardians. "They appeared in this region in the 1840s, with significant capital but no clear source of income. Within 2 decades, they owned half the county." I glanced toward the ridge, where the Ashwood brothers maintained their vigil. Evangeline suggested their wealth came from cultural preservation and historical investments. Cultural preservation. His laugh was bitter. More likely, cultural exploitation. I found references to Price family involvement in ventures that walked the line between entertainment and criminality, private gambling establishments, exclusive performances for wealthy patrons, import businesses that avoided certain inconvenient regulations. We reached the amphitheater to find that our careful excavation work had been improved overnight. Professional-grade equipment was arranged around the site, and the entrance to the underground chamber had been enlarged and reinforced with wooden supports. A generator hummed nearby, powering electric lights that turned our mysterious passage into something clinical and mundane. "It appears Mrs. Price doesn't wait for consent," I murmured. But despite my anger at the presumption, I had to admit the improvements made our work easier. With proper lighting and tools, we could examine the vault more thoroughly than before. Professor Hale had brought books on ancient locking mechanisms, and together we spent the morning studying the symbols that covered the vault's surface. "These aren't random decorations," he said, tracing patterns with his finger. "They're a combination lock, musical notation combined with mathematical sequences. Someone with knowledge of both music theory and engineering designed this. It took us 3 hours to decipher the pattern. The symbols corresponded to specific notes, which when played in sequence created a mathematical progression that aligned with mechanical tumblers inside the vault. I hummed the melody while Professor Hale pressed the symbols in order, and with a sound like distant thunder, the vault slowly opened. The treasures inside took my breath away. Manuscripts in multiple languages, musical scores in handwriting I recognized from famous composers, artifacts that belonged in museums, and jewelry that could have ransomed kingdoms. But it was the leather-bound ledger at the bottom of the vault that made my hands shake as I lifted it. The ledger was a masterpiece of record-keeping, documenting decades of transactions in meticulous detail. Names I recognized from local history were paired with services that made me understand why the vault had been sealed so carefully. Bribes to customs officials, payments for special entertainment that clearly crossed moral and legal boundaries, profits from ventures that exploited both performers and audiences. "Look at these entries," Professor Hale whispered, pointing to a section dated 15 years earlier. Import fees waived for cultural artifacts, but the description suggests something far more valuable than art was being smuggled. I turned the pages with growing horror and fascination. The Amphitheater hadn't just been a performance venue, it had been the headquarters for a network of corruption that reached into every level of local society. Wealthy patrons paid enormous sums for access to entertainment that ranged from artistic to depraved, while the profits funded political campaigns, business ventures, and social influence that shaped our entire region. But it was the final entries that made my blood run cold. The Price family name appeared repeatedly in the recent pages, along with payments for security services and problem resolution. The last entry, dated just 2 years ago, was particularly chilling. E-Price, eliminate documentation risks, payment pending resolution. "Evangeline hasn't just inherited her family's wealth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's actively continuing their business." Professor Hale was examining a collection of photographs tucked between the ledger's pages. His face went pale as he studied them. "Mrs. Kane, these images, they document activities that would destroy reputations and end political careers. This isn't just historical evidence, it's blackmail material. The implications crashed over me like a cold wave. The vault wasn't just a treasure trove, it was a weapon. Whoever controlled its contents could destroy or protect some of the most powerful families in the state." No wonder Evangeline was so interested in coordinating the archaeological project. She wasn't trying to preserve history. She was trying to control it. "We have to get this evidence to the authorities," I said, but even as I spoke, I realized the flaw in that plan. According to the ledger, many of those authorities were either current clients or descendants of former ones. "Mrs. Kane," Professor Hale said slowly, "I think we may have just discovered why the amphitheater was buried and why anyone who finds it tends to have unfortunate accidents." From above, I heard the sound of approaching horses. More than 2 this time, enough to suggest that our discovery had been observed and reported. I looked at the ledger in my hands, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. Keep the evidence and become a target for elimination. Turn it over to Evangeline and become complicit in ongoing corruption. Try to expose it publicly and risk destroying innocent people alongside the guilty. But as I thought of the beautiful chamber around us, the preserved instruments and costumes that spoke of artistic passion murdered by greed, I realized there was really only one choice that honored the voices that had been silenced. "Professor," I said, tucking the ledger into my coat, "I think it's time we found ourselves a newspaperman." Samuel O'Connell was everything a small-town newspaper editor should be. Ink-stained fingers, skeptical eyes, and a reputation for asking questions that made comfortable people uncomfortable. His office above Miller's Hardware smelled of tobacco and coffee, and every surface was covered with the organized chaos of someone who dealt in facts for a living. "You're telling me that you've found evidence of a criminal conspiracy spanning generations, and it's all hidden in a 90-cent amphitheater?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone who'd heard every variety of tall tale the human imagination could produce. "I'm telling you that I can prove the Price family fortune was built on exploitation, a corruption and worse," I said, placing the ledger on his desk, "and that Evangeline Price is currently using intimidation and threats to cover it up." Samuel opened the ledger carefully, his skepticism fading as he read the meticulous entries. For 20 minutes, he turned pages in silence while I watched his expression shift from doubt to amazement to something approaching fear. "Dear God," he finally whispered, "if even half of this is accurate, Mrs. Kane, do you understand what you're holding?" "Evidence," I said simply. "A death warrant," he corrected. "These names, half the county commissioners, 3 state senators, the railroad commissioner, judges, sheriffs, this ledger could bring down the entire regional power structure." He closed the book and sat back, running his hands through his graying hair. "It could also get us both killed. The Ashwood brothers have a reputation for making problems disappear permanently. Then what do you suggest? That we let this evidence rot in a vault while Evangeline Price continues profiting from her family's crimes?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, weighing ethics against survival with the careful deliberation of someone who'd faced such choices before. "We publish," he said finally, "but we do it smart. We start with hints, build public interest, force them to react defensively instead of proactively." Over the next week, Samuel crafted a series of articles that walked the line between revelation and protection. He wrote about the archaeological significance of the amphitheater, the evidence of sophisticated cultural activities in our region's past, and the mysterious resistance certain parties showed to historical preservation. He never mentioned names directly, but anyone familiar with local politics could read between the lines. The articles generated exactly the kind of attention we'd hoped for: public fascination with the amphitheater's secrets and growing suspicion about why some people seem so eager to keep those secrets buried. The reaction was swift and terrifying. Returned home from helping Professor Hale catalogue the vaults. Contents to find my front door standing open and my parlor destroyed. My piano, the last gift from my late husband, lay in pieces, its strings cut and its frame splintered with deliberate violence. Sheet music was scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, and my mother's china lay in fragments, but it was the message pinned to my mantelpiece that made my knees weak with fear. Cut from newspaper letters, it read, "Stop digging or join your husband." The threat was clear, but it also revealed something important. Whoever had destroyed my home was desperate enough to make mistakes. Referencing James's death, an industrial accident that everyone knew was caused by faulty equipment, suggested they were either poorly informed or so rattled they weren't thinking. Clearly I was sweeping up the remains of my music collection when Samuel arrived, his face grim with controlled anger. "They hit my office too," he said, surveying the destruction. "Smashed my printing press, destroyed my files, left a similar message about continuing to ask inconvenient questions." "Are you going to stop?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Mrs. Kane, I've been a newspaperman for 30 years. I've been threatened by politicians, business owners, church leaders, and at least 3 different criminal organizations. The one thing I've learned is that when people start making threats, it means you're getting close to something they can't afford to have exposed." That evening, Samuel published what he called a special emergency edition of his newspaper. The headline read, "Local teacher threatened for historical research. What are they hiding?" The article detailed both attacks, reproduced the threatening messages, and posed pointed questions about who had the resources and motivation for such intimidation. He printed 500 copies and distributed them throughout the county before dawn, ensuring that the story reached every general store, church, and gathering place where people shared news and gossip. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By noon, I had visitors, neighbors offering support, church ladies bringing casseroles, and more than a few men promising to keep an eye on things around my property. The community that had mocked my purchase of the amphitheater was now rallying to protect my right to explore it. But support from the townspeople also meant I was no longer fighting in the shadows. Whatever happened next would happen in full view of the entire county, with all the protection and danger that publicity could bring. That afternoon, as I worked with volunteers to repair the damage to my home, I noticed new riders on the ridge above the amphitheater. More than the usual too, and armed with more than the usual discretion. Evangeline Price had clearly decided that subtle intimidation was no longer sufficient. The battle for the amphitheater's secrets was about to become a war, and I was no longer sure which side had the advantage. But as I watched my neighbors work to restore what violence had destroyed, I realized something important. The amphitheater had been built by people who believed that some truths were worth preserving, even at great personal cost. Those people had hidden their evidence carefully, trusting that someday someone would have the courage to bring it into the light. That someday was now. That someone was me, and I would not let their faith be betrayed. The invitation arrived on ivory paper, delivered by a uniformed servant who waited for my response with the patience of someone accustomed to commands being obeyed without question. Evangeline Price requested the pleasure of my company at an intimate gathering at her estate to discuss our mutual interests regarding the amphitheater project. Samuel strongly advised against accepting, but I knew this confrontation was inevitable. Better to face it on ground of Evangeline's choosing than to wait for her to choose the time and place herself. The Price mansion sat like a monument to old money on Hillcrest Avenue, its Gothic revival architecture casting long shadows in the evening light. Carriages lined the circular drive, suggesting that Evangeline's definition of intimate differed considerably from mine. As I approached the imposing front entrance, I recognized several of the names from the vault's ledger among the arriving guests. Mrs. Kane, Evangeline greeted me in the marble foyer, resplendent in emerald silk that probably cost more than my annual income. How delighted I am that you decided to join us. I think you'll find this evening quite illuminating. The gathering was everything I'd expected from someone of Evangeline's status: crystal chandeliers, imported wines, and conversation that danced around important subjects without ever quite touching them. But I noticed things others might miss: the way certain guests avoided eye contact with me, the subtle positioning of large men near exits, the fact that my wine glass was refilled by the same servant who'd delivered the invitation. It was during the dinner that Evangeline finally dropped her facade of gracious hostility. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, tapping her crystal glass with a silver knife, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Margaret Kane, the archaeologist who's been making such fascinating discoveries at the old amphitheater site." Polite applause rippled around the table, but I caught the undercurrents of nervousness. The exchanged glances that spoke of shared secrets and mutual vulnerabilities. "Mrs. Kane has uncovered some remarkable artifacts," Evangeline continued, her voice carrying a warning that only I seemed to hear. "Historical documents that shed new light on our region's cultural heritage. Of course, historical documents can be so easily misinterpreted, can't they? Taken out of context, they might paint entirely inaccurate pictures of respected families and institutions." "Truth rarely requires interpretation," I said quietly, meeting her gaze across the candlelit table. "It simply requires courage to acknowledge it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Conversations died mid-sentence as guests realized they were witnessing something more significant than dinner party small talk. "Courage," Evangeline mused, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision. Such an interesting choice of words. Because courage without wisdom often leads to tragedy, doesn't it? People who dig too deeply into matters that don't concern them sometimes find themselves overwhelmed by what they uncover. She gestured to one of the large men I'd noticed earlier. "Mr. Kane, I'd like you to meet Thomas Ashwood. Perhaps you've heard of his family's reputation for solving complex problems." Thomas Ashwood was exactly what I'd expected from the stories. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of scars that came from violence rather than honest work. But it was his brother Marcus, stepping out of the shadows near the dining room entrance, who made my blood run cold. They had positioned themselves to block any escape route, and every guest in the room knew it. "Mrs. Kane," Thomas said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone for whom violence was a routine business transaction. "Mrs. Price has been telling us about your archaeological project. She thinks you might benefit from some professional advice about site security and documentation management," Marcus added, moving closer to my chair. "Sometimes important documents get lost or damaged during excavation. Terrible shame when that happens." I realized with crystalline clarity that this entire evening had been a trap. Evangeline had invited witnesses not to protect me, but to establish an alibi. When I disappeared, as the brothers clearly intended, these respectable citizens would testify that I'd attended a lovely dinner party and left of my own accord. "Gentlemen," I said, standing carefully and keeping my voice level, "I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I have everything well in hand. Do you?" Evangeline's smile was sharp as winter ice. "Because from where I sit, it appears you've stumbled into something far beyond your understanding. The ledger you found, did you really think you were the first person to discover it? My family has been managing those particular documents for generations, ensuring they don't fall into the wrong hands." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. She just confessed to knowing about the vault's contents, to actively concealing evidence of criminal activity spanning decades. "Managing," I repeated. "Is that what you call blackmail and intimidation?" "I call it preservation," she said, her cultured mask slipping to reveal something harder and more ruthless beneath. "Those documents represent the foundations upon which half this county was built. Destroying them wouldn't bring justice, it would bring chaos and profit," I added. "Don't forget the profit you've been making from your family's legacy of corruption." The words were out before I could stop them, and I saw Thomas Ashwood's hand move toward his coat. But before he could complete whatever action he'd planned, the dining room doors burst open. Samuel O'Connell strode in, with 3 other men I recognized as local business owners who'd been vocal supporters of his newspaper coverage. They were armed and determined, having clearly planned this rescue as carefully as Evangeline had planned my capture. "Mrs. Kane," Samuel called out, his eyes never leaving the Ashwood brothers, "I believe you mentioned needing an escort home this evening." The standoff lasted exactly 10 seconds. Long enough for everyone in the room to understand that violence would have witnesses and consequences, short enough to prevent anyone from making a fatal mistake. "This isn't finished," Evangeline said as I moved toward Samuel and his allies. "No," I agreed, pausing at the dining room entrance. "It isn't, but it will be finished publicly, in daylight, where everyone can see exactly what kind of legacy your family has built." As we left the mansion, I heard Evangeline giving sharp orders to the Ashwood brothers. Whatever happened next would happen soon, and it would happen with all the violence they'd restrained tonight. The war for the amphitheater's truth was about to begin in earnest. They came at dawn, just as the mist was lifting from Blackstone Ridge. I'd spent the night at the amphitheater with Samuel and a dozen volunteers who'd answered his call for protection, but even our vigilance couldn't fully prepare us for the assault that Evangeline unleashed. The Ashwood brothers led a force of hired men, not locals, but professional troublemakers brought in from cities where violence was commonplace and witnesses were scarce. They approached on foot through the early morning fog, armed with clubs and worse, moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers rather than mere thugs. "Mrs. Kane," Thomas Ashwood called out as they surrounded the amphitheater, "Mrs. Price has made you a final offer. Surrender the documents you stole along with any copies, and this ends peacefully." "The only thing I stole," I called back from the stage, where I'd positioned myself, "was your employer's ability to hide the truth. What followed was unlike anything our quiet county had ever witnessed. The battle for the amphitheater became a clash between 2 visions of justice. Evangeline's world, where power could bury any inconvenient truth, and my belief that some secrets were too important to remain hidden. The townspeople who'd rallied to support me fought with the fury of people defending something sacred. They'd grown up with stories about the mysterious ruins, and my discoveries had transformed those childhood legends into symbols of their own heritage. They weren't just protecting an archaeological site, they were protecting their right to know their own history. But we were outnumbered and outgunned, and I knew we couldn't hold the amphitheater indefinitely. That's when Professor Hale arrived with a contingent of men I didn't recognize. "Reinforcements," he announced breathlessly. But something in his manner made my skin crawl with suspicion. The men he'd brought were well-dressed and well-armed, moving with the kind of authority that spoke of official backing. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope that justice might prevail through legal channels. Then I saw him slip away from our defensive positions and approach the Ashwood brothers under a white flag. "Mrs. Kane," Samuel said urgently, grabbing my arm. "Hale's betraying us. Look, through the chaos of the ongoing skirmish, I watched Professor Hale hand something to Thomas Ashwood, something that looked suspiciously like the photographs we'd found in the vault. In exchange, one of Hale's mysterious reinforcements passed him what appeared to be a substantial payment. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow. Hale had seen the truth in that ledger, had understood the scope of the corruption it represented, and had chosen to profit from concealing it rather than endure the professional consequences of exposing it. "The coward," I whispered. But there was no time for grief or anger. The battle was turning against us, and I realized that our only hope lay in forcing the confrontation into full public view. "Samuel," I said, making a decision that felt both desperate and inevitable, "how quickly can you gather every person in town? What are you planning?" "Justice," I said, clutching the ledger to my chest. "But it has to happen where everyone can witness it." The fighting continued around us, but I was already planning for what came next. The amphitheater had been built as a stage where voices could carry to the heavens. It was time to use it for exactly that purpose. By noon, it seemed as though the entire county had gathered at the amphitheater. Word of the morning's violence had spread like wildfire, drawing people from every farm, shop, and household within 20 miles. They came not just out of curiosity, but out of a growing sense that what happened here would determine the future of their community. I stood center stage in the amphitheater that had cost me 90 cents and nearly everything else I valued, holding the ledger that contained enough truth to topple governments. Around me, an uneasy truce had settled over the combatants, even the Ashwood brothers understood that violence before such an audience would have consequences that extended far beyond our local disputes. Evangeline Price sat in the front row like a queen holding court, surrounded by the same respectable citizens who'd attended her dinner party. But her composure couldn't quite hide the desperation in her eyes. She knew, as I knew, that whoever controlled the narrative in the next few minutes would control the future. "Friends and neighbors," I began, my voice carrying easily to the highest seats, thanks to the amphitheater's remarkable acoustics. 3 months ago, I bought these ruins for 90 cents because everyone assured me they were worthless. Today, I want to tell you what I found buried beneath this stage and why some people were willing to kill to keep it secret. I opened the ledger and began to read. Names, dates, payments, services that made the respectable audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. I read about bribes and blackmail, about exploitation disguised as entertainment, about fortunes built on the suffering of the powerless. But more importantly, I read about resistance. Buried among the records of corruption were accounts of performers who'd refused to participate in degrading spectacles, of workers who'd reported dangerous conditions, of ordinary citizens who'd tried to expose the truth only to be silenced or discredited. This amphitheater wasn't just a place where secrets were kept, I said, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. It was a place where brave people tried to speak truth to power, even when they knew it might cost them everything. Samuel stepped forward with the photographs and documents we'd preserved, displaying them for the crowd to see. "Mrs. Kane isn't asking you to take her word for any of this," he announced. "The evidence speaks for itself. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" That's when Evangeline made her final fatal mistake. Lies! She shrieked, leaping to her feet with all the fury of someone watching their carefully constructed world crumble. Forged documents and desperate fabrications from a woman who's clearly lost her mind with grief. But her outburst only made the evidence more credible. A woman secure in her innocence wouldn't have reacted with such venom to simple historical documentation. Then you won't mind if we turn all of this over to the state authorities for independent verification? I asked sweetly. The silence that followed was answer enough. Within hours, it was over. The crowd's verdict was unanimous and immediate. Evangeline Price's empire of influence collapsed as completely as if it had been built on sand. Her political allies distanced themselves. Her business partners dissolved their associations, and her social circle evaporated like morning mist. The Ashwood brothers vanished into the countryside, smart enough to recognize when a cause was lost. Professor Hale disappeared entirely, his reputation and courage destroyed by his own greed, but the amphitheater remained, and with it, a lesson about the power of truth to outlast those who would suppress it. In the months that followed, I used the genuine historical significance of the site to attract legitimate archaeologists and historians. The amphitheater was properly excavated, its secrets preserved and shared rather than hidden. It became exactly what I dreamed, a place where voices from the past could speak to the present, where art and truth triumphed over corruption and greed. I never became wealthy from my 90-cent purchase. The treasures we found went to museums, the historical documents to archives, the musical scores to conservatories where they could inspire new generations of performers. What I gained was far more valuable. The knowledge that sometimes ordinary people can triumph over extraordinary corruption simply by refusing to be silenced. The amphitheater stands restored now, hosting concerts and plays and gatherings where the community comes together to celebrate the arts. Children perform on the same stage where I once confronted the powerful with nothing but truth as my weapon. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear echoes of that ancient music, the voices of all those who refused to be silenced, singing in harmony across the years. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.